Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Sorry, guys, for the intermittent episodes over the last couple of weeks. As I discovered last year, it's difficult to schedule people around the holidays. And in the interim, by the way, we picked up a lot of new listeners, thanks to a couple of pretty prominent shout-outs. So thank you to David Litsky at Fast Company Magazine for that, and channeling Jimmy Durante here, thank you to Startup L. Jackson, whoever you are. Welcome all new listeners, and you should know I usually aim for a new episode every Monday. So please subscribe, and you'll have dozens of great internet history topics in the year to come. And we've got a great one for you today as well. If you remember episode 32, we explored the early digital media startups like Salon, Slate, Suck, Pathfinder, etc. And one site that was mentioned in that episode, but did not get a lot of detail, was Feed Magazine, aka feedmag.com or Feed. And the reason I couldn't go into much detail about Feed is because secondary sourcing about the website was difficult for me to come by 20 years on. And that's why I was absolutely delighted to make contact with Stefanie Syman. Stefanie, along with Stephen Johnson, was the co-founder of Feed. And in this episode, she recounts the wonderful time period early on when two freelance writers in New York could say to themselves, gee, why don't we just publish a magazine on the web? It's a great story of the early internet scene in New York City, and stay tuned to hear all of the people who cut their teeth at Feed and then went on to fabulous careers. Please enjoy this episode with Stefanie Syman. Stefanie Syman, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So we always, in aid of this project, like to start with asking people a little bit about their tech background. But as I see that you graduated with a literature degree from Yale, I'm curious. Did you have much of a tech background when you left college or as a kid or anything like that?
No, I mean, I was kind of a math and science nerd as a young kid, and then I sort of ended up spending much more time in the humanities. And literature at the time that I was at Yale was much more like philosophy, so it was a lot of those French literary critics, deconstruction, and all of that. However, the thing that I was doing quite a bit of right before Stephen and I founded Feed was writing about technology, and I really kind of quickly understood and wanted to write about and share with the world, obviously, how much technology was really going to change everything and how much it was a culture story now, not just a business or a science story. And so I had, I think I was comfortable doing that partly because I was, as a young kid, kind of a math and science kid.
So in the early 90s, you're, I guess, freelancing as a writer, a journalist, that sort of thing?
Yes, I had left a documentary film company, in part because I decided that industry was going to change so radically that a lot of the things people were being trained to do were going to be irrelevant. And then I started writing about technology, freelancing around. I did a stint as a speechwriter in the Dinkins administration. But by the time we were to Feed taking off, I had a column at the Wall Street Journal writing about technology and culture that was fairly regular and was writing for some other publications.
So with as much or as little detail as you'd like, but I'd prefer more detail, tell me the story of how the idea of Feed came about.
Well, so I should first tell you how Stephen Johnson and I were introduced.
Absolutely.
So this was, again, the early 90s. It was a college friend of mine and who happened to be a high school friend of Stephen's. And they said, and I think we met at Max Fish, that bar in the East Village, but I'm not exactly sure when we first physically met. But the way we were introduced was that Eric Lifton, who introduced us, said, "Hey, you guys both have email. You should be email buddies." I mean, that's that's how few people were online. I mean, and in any way, it was still rare enough. So, in the circle of very educated people who certainly all had personal computers, we stood out. So we became email buddies. And I was joking with someone recently, I would love to see what we said on email to each other. I have no memory. But and Stephen at the time was writing a column that was similar to mine in terms of like looking at technology and culture for the London Guardian. So we kind of had similar purviews. I think he may have technically still been in grad school at the time. And as I was writing about technology and culture, and I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal about the web, telling everyone, explaining what the web was, it was pretty clear to me that I would eventually jump in and do something in digital media. I just didn't really know the how or the when. And so Stephen being Stephen and, sort of coming at the world with ideas nearly fully formed, although he won't say it that way, he was, I think, mulling over the same thing, and it was nearing, we were headed into a big election in 96, and he's thinking, why don't we just do this as sort of web magazine? And so he kind of sketched out what feed might be, Microsoft Word doc, and he shared it with all his friends. And most of them was like, "Oh, great idea, Stephen, you'll never do it." And I was like, yeah, this is about what I'm looking for. This is like what this kind of checks all the boxes. When do we get started? So that's pretty much how it happened. Mm-hmm. And neither of us knew how to code, but HTML was really easy to learn. I mean, it was dead simple at the time. And so simple, you really couldn't do much visually with it at all. And so we had to create all these weird hacks to lay out a page that looked at all inviting to the reader, because what we really both committed to was this notion that the web wasn't just a place for lists and little tiny chunks of content and kind of information. It was actually a place where you could find good, thoughtful writing. And we also, I think, wanted to, in some way, balance out some of the techno-utopianism of Wired magazine, which launched in 93, which I loved. Early Wired was amazing. And I remember the bus ads that just had the name of the magazine that went by. And I remember seeing those ads and knowing it was going to be something interesting and important. But, it was, I'm from California, but it's that California, go too far in the optimistic, messiah direction of technology. And we felt there was room to be enthusiastic but critical. And also room for, a new voice around other stuff. And I think we were, very inspired by Spy Magazine, too, as sort of the sort of humor and the wit and the, sort of not having really wanting to challenge certain ways of both writing and approaching certain subjects. So, in addition to having this great opportunity around the election coming up. So it didn't take us long. I think we met, I remember it being, I feel like it was November of 94 when I read Stephen's proposal for Feed. And we launched the site 6 months later. But I honestly don't remember how much effort or energy we were devoting to it, certainly close to it. I think a lot of it was signing up writers and convincing our friends to contribute, because that was going to be the issue. Like, the coding was not too hard and we could do it ourselves. The graphics we found a guy to do, but we wanted to have enough content to launch with something that looked substantial. And fortunately, we were all really young. We weren't that far out of college, and we had a bunch of friends who were trying to make it as writers, which is funny to think of now because so many of them are such successful writers. But, no one was assuming they were ever going to get the promotion in the New Yorker or any other place of repute, maybe here or there. People were still pretty early in their careers and still really hustling. So one of those people was Sam Lipsyte, who is a great fiction writer and a hilarious nonfiction writer. And I believe we launched with his story, Memoirs of an Info whore, which was his account of being in an infomercial. And it is still one of the funniest pieces of writing I've ever read. And, we also started thinking about creating conversation online. And so not too soon after launch, started really setting up these dialogues with big thinkers. And I remember, I think it was even in that first year, we did a dialogue. Stephen remembers Sequence way more than I do. I think we did a dialogue. We did one on feminism and one on tech. And we would reach out to Katha Pollitt, who was already very established, or David Galertner, who's a big deal. And we'd be like, hi, we're starting, just started this online magazine. Would you come and have a dialogue about this topic? And we're going to bring in some other thinkers. And they would say yes. And we were always shocked. We were like, we're no one. They don't know. We're not the New York Times. We're not Esquire. We are not even Wired. And yet people wanted to participate. And it was very gratifying. And exciting.
Well, you were very early on the web, so I feel like that your moment was perfect because people are wanting to experiment with this new thing that they're suddenly hearing about all the time, and you're there to experiment with.
Yes, and I do think that's absolutely right. And there was enough up there to give people a sense of kind of how we came at things, and I guess we, seemed legitimate enough when you read what was already up there, and smart enough. So the other thing that happened, though, which sort of surprised us, was we did hire a publicist, and again, this was all our first company. We've both gone on to help create other companies. So it was all kind of bumbling, and we kind of knew what we were doing and mostly had no clue whatsoever. And we hired a publicist that we stuck with for a while, and it wasn't always clear if it was his efforts or just being early, but really quickly people started writing about us. And so I remember, I think it was 96 that Walt Mossberg wrote this really glowing piece about us. And that, I think, really put us on the map because he was, again, Walt Mossberg is an institution at this point. But at the time, even then, even 20 years ago, he was really a well-known and well-regarded tech reporter.
Walt Mossberg has always been Walt Mossberg in a way, yeah.
Exactly. And so we kind of, got a surprising amount of press, and we were very grateful for it, but we also thought it was really funny because some of the accounts of what we were doing just sounded so aspirational. So I think the one that really tickled both Stephen and I, one of the early ones, was a write-up in Wired. So it was said something about I don't know where it was, but there was one that said, Wired meets the New Yorker, and we were like, hell yeah. And then there was one write-up that said, the East Coast literary establishment comes to the web. And we're like, yeah, we are working out of our apartments. We are, we're published authors, but not really. Many of the contributors are totally green still. So it's funny what people project onto you, but obviously useful fictions. I think in some of them we lived up to. So those first years, I think the first year we were working out of our apartment.
You know what? Can I stop you for a second? And because there's a couple of kind of nuts and bolts questions that I have. First of all, going all the way back, when I talk to people early on the web, it's always about this. It's new thing that comes about, and what can you do with it? Some people want to sell things on it and stuff, but a lot of people have said, well, the most obvious thing was it was a publishing platform, right? So essentially, your idea is to just take what is a magazine and put it online. Was that basically original vision?
Yes, insofar as we thought it was a place for really high quality, thoughtful content, but no, insofar we wanted to innovate beyond a magazine. And so it took us a while, but then we were really early to have threaded comments against every piece of content. Our dialogues were took place over time, and so episodic, so people were posting. So that is somewhere between more almost of an interview podcast format and a regular straight publishing format, because you can add an installment in almost real time.
Well, put a pin in that, because I will come back to it, but I'm curious how influenced were you by the early 90s zine scene? Because
definitely in there.
Okay, because you were called web zines. This is before the era of blogs and things like that. And
yes, but I also think we're constantly experimenting with what the link meant and how much to weight it. And you also have to remember there was so little else online, and the technology was really primitive. So in a way, all you could do was publish text, link to it, and you're kind of done. I mean, then comments happened, and there's the more social dimension kind of came a little bit later. But even at launch, that was it was almost like two universes. You had the echoes of the world and the place where people were talking to each other, the BBSs, and then the web, which was more about linking and content.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another really basic question.
Sure.
How are you funding this? Are you just funding it yourself? Who's paying for the computers, for the web server, that sort of thing?
Right, and there is probably a funny story that I could tell now. So it wasn't very expensive because, all the feed could fit on 2 floppy disks when we launched, and I can tell you why I know this. And so, I think really all we were paying for at the beginning was a little bit of server, space. We got a deal on it, and then writers, and we did not pay writers well at the beginning. Over time we paid them better, but at the beginning we paid them much more modestly. Stephen, I think, funded the beginning of it completely, but we did do friends and family. So that's not true. It was friends and family. So Stephen could invest a little bit, and he can speak more to it, because he always was more on the fundraising side. So it was a friends and family. And then over time, the investor, Chris Anderson, who now runs TED, and Esther Dyson ended up being investors.
Okay.
So, we eventually added some real investors. And as we got press, we were approached by a ton of people, most of whom we couldn't tell a convincing story to them or to ourselves about it being this massive business. Because I think we always understood that the feeds of the world were kind of niche content that could grow as part of a bigger ecosystem, but we couldn't with a straight face say this is going to be a 50 million top line business. No one was on the web. The audience is tiny. And I think we saw that, and we saw that it would be dishonest and not true to our vision to present it as more than what it was.
Okay, so you mentioned vision, and so this is the last of my sort of nuts and bolts questions. For the benefit of people that didn't have the chance to read feed, what was your editorial focus? Like, what are you covering in terms of topics and stuff like that?
Yeah, so we were actually pretty general interest, and I think the thing that distinguished us is we were general interest, but we had a lot of focus on technology. And then early on, there was a fair bit of political coverage, because the election, and that was when Gingrich was doing his thing and making noise about all of the things. And now I'm trying to remember, there were some really hilarious manifestos. I think he had a manifesto coming up to the 96 election. So it was technology, politics, and culture. We really, again, were wide-ranging. A lot of it, I think what set us apart was, one, as a general interest magazine, dedicating a fair bit on culture to the medium, obviously. And 3, we were not afraid to be opinionated and have a lot of voice, because honestly, we didn't have a huge reporting budget, so we couldn't send people out into the field to do anything really exciting. But what we could do was come at things with a fresh angle and a kind of fresh voice. I don't know how snarky I would find the voice now, were I to read a lot of it. I don't think it was too snarky, but it was a little snarky.
Well, that's sort of, like you said, the East Coast versus West Coast attitude, kind of.
Yeah, and then we were young, and we poked fun at things, and, so in that way, I think cleverness got us far, given the budgetary constraints, I would say.
You had mentioned that basically what you did is you just reached out to friends that were young writers like yourselves to produce this content. Yep. I'm going to list some names because you said a lot of them have gone on now 15, 20 years later to great careers. I'm going to list some names, but when I'm done, please add more names that might come to mind in terms of people that have gone on to have amazing careers, like Anna Marie Cox, Clay Shirky. I didn't know Josh Marshall did some writing for you guys.
Yep.
Steve Botto,
yeah.
Was he the executive producer of The Daily Show eventually or something?
Yeah.
I don't know. Go on and name anyone
else.
Yeah.
So John Cook, who's a big editor at Gawker, did some stuff for us. So some of them are writers and some of them are editors. Alex Abramovich, Alex Ross, who's a longtime New Yorker writer, Christine Keneally, who's had a really nice science nonfiction career, Amanda Griscom, who actually has a piece in the New Yorker, just a recent piece in the New Yorker Online, Sam Lipsyte, as I mentioned before. Who else? Others will come to mind. Oh, Catherine Schultz, who had a great book on being wrong, and who's a New Yorker writer now. There'll be others that come to mind. But it's, Elaine Blair was an editor for us, and she's a book reviewer for the Times and New York Review of Books, and super, talented. So many people.
All right, so let's get into the details of how this is a business and how this is a publishing entity. I mean, you guys are just hard coding this, right? Like you said, you taught yourself HTML, so there's no such thing as a CMS or anything like that.
Oh God, no. You're just, and there's no CSS, there's no styling. To create a left-hand margin, we had to insert an invisible GIF.
I remember that.
GIF.
Yeah.
Yep. And so if you had to make a copy edit, you'd screw up the whole layout. It was like linotype age, You'd have to recode everything.
And when you launch, I guess there's no real publishing schedule, but I'm thinking about how all this stuff evolves into the online publishing world that we know today. Like, did you have a publishing schedule? Were you like, all right, we'll have something new every Monday? How did that sort of functional thing evolve?
Right. Well, at the beginning it was, we kept our day jobs or, other stuff for a while. So at the beginning it was just as soon as we could get something else up, the publishing schedule. And then as we grew, we hired editors and got on a much more regular publishing schedule. And eventually we created something called The Filter, which we originally called The Filter, which evolved into The Daily, which was essentially a blog post. And so what it was we would take a little quote from another media source, and often because it was so early, this feature or column launched early in feed, I think, with the launch of the site in May of '95. We would have to actually create a little scan of this quote. And it was an image because the publication from which it was derived was not yet online. And so to comment on other media at that time was often to have to you couldn't just simply link to it is the point. You'd have to kind of create this funny hack. That column then would, spend 3 or 4 paragraphs with some sort of witty commentary on some media happening or some newsy thing. That became The Daily, which was a daily, really kind of quick-hitting, clever column. And Clay Shirky actually, has said some things about how writing that column really taught him a lot because you had to be so tight. Every single word counted.
You kept the word counts brief on purpose.
Really, yeah, exactly. So it was intended to be the super quick digestible content that you would read every day so people would come back to the site. And it did work that way, and we did get them up every single day. Amanda Griscom was a total taskmaster in making that happen. So there was some stuff like that was obviously quite frequent. And then we'd have bigger features that, we'd roll out one a week. I mean, I can't quite remember. I know there was some stuff, again, on that daily timetable, then other stuff that was weekly, and then packages that would be, at a less regular interval. But, by year 2, we were publishing at a pretty steady clip.
Well, let's talk about making money then, because again, yes. If you're in the early days where there's no such thing as a CMS, you're hard coding everything. You're also in the early days of advertising. I mean, you're launching in '95, so Hotwired had already started its banner ads experiment. There was already people experimenting with advertising. But when you guys do it, was it difficult? How did you do it? I don't even think would DoubleClick have been around at that point? Were there any? How did you get ads?
So the first thing to say is that we for quite a while, and it started in '97, were the New York bureau chief for Hotwired, New York bureau of Hotwired, and so Austin Bunn was feeding stories to Hotwired, and we had this deal with them. I cannot remember the business terms, honestly. So, it would just be direct insertion order type stuff, and you just code the banner into your site or drop it into your site. We raised additional capital because there really wasn't a big business and it depended on audience, and the web audience was tiny. I mean, we were doing well and we had a devoted following. But I think that was always the challenge of balancing, being able to scale revenue when, even if you're killing it, your total addressable market is still relatively small. And so by the time we were into the later 90s, we hired someone who ran biz dev who was selling ads and doing partnerships. But even selling out our site, we couldn't cover our costs, honestly, because, again, we had healthy traffic, but we didn't have a fire hose. Some of our competitors were positioned, I don't know if you remember the launch of Slate, but Microsoft was driving a huge amount of traffic to them. So all of our traffic was, organic audience. And so it was very difficult to scale that at the time. We knew some of the tricks of it. If you got a link on Slashdot, we joked. There was I don't know if you remember this, you would be Slashdotted and your site would come down.
Right.
Under the weight of the traffic. But that was always a challenge. And so you may or may not remember, we set up I think we started working on it in '99, a network of sites, of independent sites, to sort of consolidate business operations.
That's Automatic Media?
Yes. So that was Us Suck, Alt Culture, and then we launched Plastic out of that. I don't know if you remember Plastic at all.
We'll put a pin in that one also, because we'll come back to Plastic in a second. Go on.
So scanning the environment, it seemed sort of obvious that one way to get to a sustainable business model was, consolidate business operations across more sites, have the traffic, the virtuous circle of traffic through them, and then you get some scale. And we did it, so that's when we teamed up with those guys. Of course, the challenge was I think we were probably starting to think about it in '99, but in terms of really getting to, maybe even a little sooner. But it required an additional infusion of capital, and we raised that capital, but closed that round of financing. It took 6 months longer than we had anticipated, in part because the lead investor was Lycos. Your listeners may know, the search engine, one of the early search engines. And we were doing that, raising that money, right, and Lycos was, investing in this rolled up kind of media network right as they were being sold to the Spanish company. And so it just dragged out that deal for quite a number of months. And then by the time the money came in, we were in, I think it was already spring of 2000, and everyone knows what happened then. It was a bloodbath.
Right. Before we get to Plastic, this is more of a comment than a question, but when we think of online media today, you guys are existing in the late 90s in an era that's not only before social media as a driver of traffic, but you're actually functionally before search has been solved. You know what I mean?
Yes,
So
yes,
like
we were pre-Google.
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah,
it had to be that your biggest problem was discovery. Aside from the fact that the audience isn't as
yes,
big as it is now, there weren't
yep,
as many people
absolutely.
online, but discovery had to be one of your biggest problems.
Yes, yes, and that's why earned media was so great at the beginning, because that's how people found out about us. And then it was, again, getting links from Slashdot. I think there were some other sites we knew that if we were linked from, but it definitely became harder also as there were some, kind of similar sites out there, and it got a little bit more crowded. And the value of having a Microsoft, with their Explorer driving traffic to Slate was inestimable. We felt very disadvantaged in the face of Slate.
Right, because they not only have a backer with a big wallet, but also
Yes.
they can just feed traffic, unending
Exactly.
amounts of traffic, right?
Exactly.
So,
I mean, I respect those guys now, but we felt, we should have figured that out. Obviously, we had no connections to those companies, really. I mean, I do remember Yahoo being a list of links, and anyway.
Well, you mentioned Slashdot, and you mentioned I mentioned social media, but so Plastic. I have much more of a memory of Plastic, and Plastic was something that you launched after Automatic was created, and you're combining forces with Suck and things like that. And this is where you are starting to see some kind of early social media elements entering things.
Yes.
So describe for people what plastic.com was.
So we were, we really took this sort of Slashdot model where you have, and this is before blogs. This is well before blogs. So where you have people contributing stories or being able to contribute a story and that it being upvoted or downvoted and, commented on. And as a contributor, there were like levels of participation that was graded in terms of what your permissions were and what you could do on the site. And you would get, we call them karma points for being a good kind of community member and contributing great content and also like behaving well. And so it was kind of like Reddit, but not as, the behavior that we were trying to promote was much more positive than what seems to have happened in many many areas of Reddit. And it was really focused more on pop culture, not technology. So we thought like you could use that model and have this like fun community around pop culture. It wouldn't exclude technology, but Slashdot was pretty propeller head focused and really spoke to the growing community of developers. So this was going to be more of a people who are into pop culture. And I was just remembering some of the ads. They were really funny. And I wish I had the copy. Like, I remember bits of the copy, but they were, like, kind of in your face copy-wise. And we launched it right as everything was kind of coming undone because, our money ran out, essentially. And it actually, for the brief moment it existed, there was quite a bit of participation and excitement about it, but alas,
the timing was poor.
Yep.
You made me think of something that we skipped over. This community and commenting and audience feedback and things like that. Going back to feed, you said that you had from the very beginning you had comments and things like that, or not.
We had, at first it was a link, and literally it was called, this is embarrassing, the feed bag, like with a horse and a little image of a horse. And you could use that to submit feedback. And I'm trying to remember how it was displayed, but at some point early in our history, because it was before 98 because of where our offices were. It was when we had offices way down at 11 Broadway. We hired this guy, Erwin Chen, who coded us threaded comments. And that we were one of, and we would allow people to comment on every single piece of content. It wasn't some sort of general comment section. It was every piece of content. And it was interesting to watch the trends because we could publish. We always knew when we would get a lot of comments. Tech stories tend to generate a lot of comments, almost no matter what the kind of angle was. And then real opinion, polemical pieces would generate a lot of comments, not so surprisingly, but at the time it was surprising because we would also publish these beautifully written, thoughtful pieces that were just lovely and smart and great pieces of writing, 0 comments or like 2 comments. And it was interesting how people didn't feel as invited into the conversation when the writing was at a certain level and not about something that was just triggered an immediate like opinion reflex. And in general, comments skewed more negative. So it's just like how, from the beginning, internet comments have worked. The people who had positive things to say either didn't say, just didn't feel as compelled to say it. They might have thought it, that was a fabulous piece or that was a good point, but they didn't feel like that urgency to get their voice into the mix.
So I want to close with a couple of multi-part questions here, but just kind of looking back questions. And, you mentioned that plastic was poorly timed because the bubble was bursting and feed, had a limited life. And even, Slate and Salon, they're still around, but these early content sites on the web always were struggling for revenue and things like that. But it kind of looks to me, looking back, and I wonder if you agree that, look, it was just too early. I mean, people forget that when the dot-com bubble burst, there's still only maybe 100 million people online. So today when there's billions of people online, it's easier to survive and get a large enough audience to survive. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And in some ways, I think it's kind of a curse to be too early because you clearly see what's going to happen, but you can't actualize it. So I remember very clearly having many conversations and saying, no, there's going to be all sorts of advertising on the web. Like, you don't understand. This is happening. And people being super skeptical. And it's true. There might have been some ads on the web, but there weren't enough people to make that a scaled business. But yeah, I think it's painful as an entrepreneur to be too early because, you're like, yeah, we called that one, but it didn't matter.
Would you comment for me a little bit about what we've talked about or touched on in terms of the voice, and we've already mentioned snark, I think, a couple of times, but the idea that what has become the voice of blogs, the voice of online content that we know, came out of things like feed and things like suck and it mutated almost into things like Gawker and things like that, and how where that voice came from and how it survived maybe.
If you think back to what was going on besides the internet at the time, I mean, this was the early 90s, so we were in a recession. People forget 91 was a big recession. My generation, Gen X, came out of college, many of us, into a recession, which means, I didn't know. I mean, I'm sure there were some people who went to law school or professional schools, but a lot of people who would have ordinarily gotten on a career track were kind of still a little bit aimless at age 25, and hadn't really found their thing yet. And so in some ways, we were all kind of available. Like the risk that we were taking was perhaps smaller or less obvious than it might have been if the economy had been absolutely booming in the early 90s and we had all found great jobs. So in a way, the fact that we were still in this softer economy, creatives, that those businesses weren't kind of sucking us into the, in completely yet, made us, remember Slacker, the movie Slacker.
Right.
I mean, what no one talks about is we were slacking because we couldn't find great jobs. It's not like we just kind of wanted to hang out. I mean, certainly there was some of that, but a lot of it was just, things were shifting in terms of the macroeconomics. And so that was the context. AIDS, people forget. We were coming of age with the AIDS crisis. and that really puts a dystopian kind of cast on things. And so I think George Bush Sr. was in office in 91. We were coming into the Clinton years when things started to shift, but I mean, Clinton, it took him 2 terms to really create all that wealth, which you might even argue with. So I think there was just a overall kind of view that like the way things had been working was not working out, really not working out. And so call it cynicism, call it youth, and a lot of us, in terms of how, we had read all these like Marxist thinkers, whether or not we really consider ourselves in any way aligned with them, we were coming at culture from a somewhat critical perspective, but also couldn't take ourselves too seriously and wanted to have fun. And so there was a playfulness too, that combined with that critique of, sort of post-industrial society.
Mm-hmm. 2 final questions, both based on the fact that, over the last 15 years, you've sort of stayed in the game, as it were, as a consultant and launching other digital native content companies and things like that. The first question would be, what do you think of the publications that have digital native publications that have risen up in the last few years? I'm thinking of things like Vox, The Verge, BuzzFeed, things like that. Obviously, they have the advantages that we've already said you didn't have. Advertising is mature. The audiences are bigger. What do you think about these companies? And I don't know. Is it just, are you a little jealous, like you said, as the early bird, that they're succeeding where you didn't have the chance to?
Well, not jealous. I mean, I think I'm gratified that people have, to some extent, figured it out. I think there are a couple things going on. One is the internet really has devalued the role of the writer in terms of the economics, and many creatives. And I know Stephen's written a big piece about the music industry that challenges that. But I think in terms of pure writing, it changed industry dynamics so much. You could be a mid-list author and have a nice upper middle class living, send your kid to good schools 20, 30, 40 years ago. You cannot do that now, because what you get paid to write is a fraction of what you used to get paid to write. So I think I'm ambivalent about that. So that's it's quite an unfortunate sort of unintended consequence of it, of this whole rise of web media. And I do think about that, that we were part of making that happen. And I don't know at what point it will shift. I think eventually it will shift, because you do see in the history of media these moments of explosion and then contraction. And so, from my research on the book I wrote, there were 40 English language dailies in New York City in like 1910 or 11, which is kind of unimaginable. But now you have that on the web. That contracted into a handful of newspapers. So I think there are cycles. So, but it's kind of fun to watch the evolution. I think some of the snarkiness and mean-spirited dimensions of media that get kind of amplified so much, I find disturbing. I think the opportunity to really kind of stalk and attack people, like all the stuff going on in Gamergate, is totally depressing. I think what I think about a lot more is the gender balance around not so much the media dimension, but just the general startup ecosystem and on the VC side, which is, mind-numbingly awful.
Especially on the VC side, yeah.
Yeah, but still, even on the startup, it's the VC side is bad, partly because the startup side is bad. So more women founders are getting funded, but it's still a vanishingly small fraction of total activity.
Final question, similar to that last one, but looking at the landscape right now, not in terms of business, but in terms of quality of writing, and online, digital native publications, quality of writing. I'm thinking of places like Longform, the Atavist, the All, places like that. What do you think of the current state of writing in the digital realm?
Well, I wish I could say more about that, because I was reading all that stuff, but I'm sadly not. I'm not reading that kind of writing right now, because I'm actually about to take a new job.
Okay.
which requires a just slightly different focus. But I mean, I think there's great stuff out there in general. So I think you can find it. I still don't think the business model problem has been fully solved. I mean, it's been solved for now, kind of, but in a not terribly sustainable way, as far as I can tell.
Well, Stefanie Syman, thank you for telling us this story and remembering all that great stuff at the beginning of digital media on the web.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.